Hey, this is Jerry Strauss, host of Hollywood Happy Place. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hey, it's Baxter Colburn here from Public House Media. Did you know that we just added a store here at Public House Media? No, I'm not talking about a grocery store where you can go buy apples or bananas or peanut butter, which are all fantastic, especially when peanut butter's on all of those. Anyway, we've added a store here at Public House Media so you can not only come and represent your favorite podcast network, but also represent your favorite shows as well, too. Just go over to thephmedia.com and look in the top right corner where you'll see the button that says Store. Click on that and you can search through all of our great products. Or if you go to our Facebook page, Public House Media, you can see on the left-hand side a tab that says Store. All of our products are listed there as well too. It's the new Public House Media store. You don't want to miss it. It is fantastic. Buy some of that great swag to support your favorite shows and to support Public House Media. Check it out today.
This is Sam Kirby, host of Cinema Stories here on Public House Media. Thank you for tuning into the following broadcast here on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, Cinema Stories, where we talk about movie and TV news and reviews, and maybe, just maybe, we'll learn a little something about ourselves. If not, then maybe I made you laugh a couple of times. I don't know. New episodes air bi-weekly on Tuesdays. Thanks again for checking out the totally spectacular following broadcast here on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. Find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Check out How to Write Good on Facebook, like and share. I'll be having, you've already noticed that I've been having some more posts related to language or other things similar to this podcast. If you've listened to this podcast before, the podcast name is How to Write Good, but it covers more than just that. It's really, in some cases, it's things that I find interesting that I think that are useful to think about and talk about. Besides the fact that I believe that writing, if you're writing well, it's really that you've thought about a lot of things. You're able to articulate what you're thinking well. So that's why I don't just stick to how to write well, or I don't just stick to things related to writing. I think that as a writer, you really need to have different interests besides writing. And I think that if you don't have interests besides writing, you're never going to actually grow as a writer. You're never going to actually write something interesting because you can only make things sound pretty, if that makes sense. Because most people don't care that you can write something in a way that sounds pretty. They want it to flow. They want it to make sense. They want it to flow and they want it to make sense. So if you only have ever thought about writing and you've only ever, if you can make something make sense, all you can make sense is writing, right? And all you can make, then you can make it sound pretty. You can make it flow because you have that ability to write. But if you don't actually understand something else, you're never going to be able to articulate that well. You're never going to be able to have that flow and have that understanding of something else. So that is why I talk about a lot of different things in How to Write Good. If just as a reminder to those of you listening, I already said that How to Write Good is brought to you by Public House Media. So please check them out if you enjoy this podcast. And we are finishing up this week our last part on Obsession. But since I don't have as much material left on Obsession, as I said last week, I wasn't sure if I was going to get through the whole thing, and of course I didn't. Since we don't have as much material, we get to go back into the swing of things, and we are going to be having a word of the week and a fallacy of the week as well, because I think it's useful. If you do like writing, I think it's good to have a larger vocabulary. And even if you don't like writing, I think that a larger vocabulary is useful to you as well. So we are going back toward that. I hope that this is valuable to you, even if you aren't a writer, because I think that having different thoughts in your head, hearing different opinions, I mean, even hearing my opinion, I guess, is useful, because then you get to throw around what somebody else thinks, and you get to say whether you agree with them or not. And it's certainly the case that someone disagrees with something I say, because I don't try to avoid topics that might offend someone. I don't try to avoid topics that someone may disagree with or that are contentious. And we've been talking about fandoms this past we had Seth on last week, but we've been talking about fandoms these past few weeks. I mean the weeks before that, and you should know by now that I have a few negative thoughts towards fandoms, or I have a few negative thoughts toward this obsessive view of media in someone's life. But we'll get into that in a little bit. We'll get back to what I was thinking about and what I was talking about before. But first, we have our word of the week. Our word of the week this week is ostensible. And ostensible is, I think, a very useful word 2 weeks ago. So last week we didn't have a word of the week. Last week we didn't have a fallacy of the week. I'm sorry about that, because I know it's the best part of the show, because it's not me thinking about something and talking about it. And I know that you come here for the word of the week, and I know you come here for the fallacy of the week, and you wait. And that's why I have the fallacy of the week at the end, because you have to wait to the end. So ostensible means appearing as such, but not necessarily so. This is more useful than the word for the day before yesterday, because it's shorter, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's a very unique meaning of the word. You could say that this show is ostensibly good, but it doesn't appear to be good, so we can't use it in that way. But you could say I'm ostensibly intelligent, and I appear to be intelligent, but I'm not necessarily intelligent. And I think that comes in the area of someone who can talk well, and I think that I can talk fairly well. I think there's some cases, especially when I'm talking to someone else, where I don't have a clearly formulated idea, where I use a lot of word whiskers. So word whiskers, if you aren't aware of that, are ums and ahs, and like they're words that are filler words that don't make they don't add anything to what you're saying. And I think that happens to me sometimes. Right now I'm doing fairly well, and I think it's because I'm well rested and I'm fairly comfortable. All right, so we are going to get into our accidental essence, and we are going to be talking about fandoms and obsession. What we've talked, if you haven't already looked into this, or you haven't already listened to the past 2 episodes, this is the 3rd one about obsession, and I didn't expect to go that long, as I said. But if you haven't listened to those beforehand. It might help you. I think that you can probably listen to these as a standalone episode, and it's fine. I think that I try to have thoughts that can be alone, and they don't necessarily have to be together with something else. But I think that listening to those other episodes will give more information to you about what I'm thinking and my background and where I think these things come from. So we left off with talking about how someone in a scientific field or a career is different than someone who is in a fandom. And I was just looking at, and I'll have a post up about him at some point, but on Facebook, because I've been trying to be better about posting things. So I've actually put a note on my phone saying post at this time, so that I actually do it, because I don't have a very good memory, and I've said that before. I have a memory for certain things. I can deal with certain things really well. But I've been looking into the idea of flow, and I've talked about him before, and I really like this theorist. And I was talking last episode. His name is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he's from the Czech Republic or Hungary, or I don't know exactly, maybe Austria or maybe Swiss. I think he's Czech, but I'm not positive. But last week I was talking about this idea that maybe there's a difference between how someone who is into a fandom, maybe there's a difference between someone in a fandom and someone in a career who's like an expert and really, really good at that. Maybe it's based on the fact that they've been doing it for so long. So the person who is a scientist, they're really like this. They're an expert in their field, and they've been an expert for at least 10 years. They've been working on this for at least 10 years. They've become an expert at this, and it's taken so much more effort than just enjoying media that they react to it differently. Now, that could be the case. Now, Csikszentmihalyi talks about how people are flow. I've talked about this before, but flow is essentially the feeling of you start to do something. You have a task that you do, and it engages your brain so much, and there's this challenge to the task, but you also have this expertise. And the challenge of the task meets your expertise, and you're able to get into this state of mind where it's fully engaging your brain, but you're also able to handle everything. So you kind of feel like I know that in the past I've seen a video from Stephen King where he talks about writing, and he says it's like hypnosis. So essentially this is like hypnosis, because you're so relaxed, but at the same time you're engaged, and you're able to do this work really, really well. Okay, so bringing it back to someone in a career, someone who is a scientist, I'm coming back to a scientist, or it doesn't matter, mathematics, whatever career, maybe it's an actor. If someone is an expert as an actor, they're able to get into this flow state. And when you have an experience like flow, you want to have that experience again. When it comes to someone in a fandom, or when not everyone in a fandom or how we classify as a fandom. So just an FYI, if you didn't listen to the last ones, I'm classifying a fandom as people who are more obsessed with this. So someone who's just a fan isn't part of a fandom. But someone who is obsessed with the material is part of a fandom. So when you're in a career, you have to actually develop tons and tons of skills to get into that flow state. Okay, it actually takes a lot of effort on your part. Csikszentmihalyi actually says it's about 10 years before you can become an expert, and it goes along with that idea of 10,000 hours. So Malcolm Gladwell, and I think I mentioned him last time I was talking about obsession. Malcolm Gladwell actually talks about how there's like 10,000 hours, and then you can become an expert at something if you put in 10,000 hours into doing that thing. Okay, and Csikszentmihalyi talks about 10 years, so 1,000 hours per year, and then you become an expert on that thing, and you can go into a state of flow based on the fact that you're an expert. You have a really good grasp on what you need to do in this area, and you also have a really good grasp on you also can meet the challenge that arises. So you can take on really high level things. If you're a mathematician and you've been a mathematician for 10 years, you're going to be able to take on really high level mathematical problems. They're going to be able to engage your brain fully, and you are going to meet that with your expertise, and you're going to feel somewhat in a hypnotized state where you are not just working on a math problem and struggling through it and being distracted, but the math is almost everything that exists to you at that time. You forget everything else. Your mind is fully focused on that. And anytime you are an expert in something and you are working in your field, you're likely going to have that sense of flow. Now, what gets in the way of that flow is distraction. So if you're anxious, you're not going to have that flow. If you're worried, I think worry and anxiety are a little different. If you're worried about something, you're not going to have that flow. If you are distraught, maybe something really bad happened in your life, so you're sad, that's going to be a distraction, and you're not going to be able to get into that flow state. Also, if you don't like your job, you're not going to get into that flow state either. So with someone who's an expert, they'll be able to get into that, but they put in tons of time. But as I talked about last week, someone who is in a fandom, they get into a flow state. I would say that they get into a flow state, but it doesn't take the effort required, okay? And I think that when you look at fandoms, if you ask guys, and I'm not trying to be mean to anyone, and you probably see this in both male and female, or they go and see the movie really late at night, and it's not a really mature action, I would say. I think that most people would agree that it isn't. I don't think that you need to be mature constantly throughout your life. Okay? I don't think that you need to act like an adult constantly. I think there's times where I don't think you should act like an infant. I think that maybe there's times where you can act stupid even if you're an adult, but we wouldn't consider so I was talking in the last episode or the episode before about obsession about Star Wars Celebration, and when you look, so what you should do if you've never seen it before is you go on YouTube, you look up Star Wars Celebration, and you look at how people react to Star Wars Celebration, and it's fairly immature. And if you really like, I know there's people who love Star Wars, and that's okay. I don't think that's a bad thing to really like Star Wars. I'm really talking about an obsession about media, and I think you can really, really like something and not necessarily be obsessed with it. And if you think you're obsessed with it, well, obsession generally is a bad thing, okay? And even if you are in a job, as I stated before, I don't think you should necessarily be obsessed with your job. I don't know if you should necessarily be obsessed with anything, because you aren't in control of your emotions, and you probably aren't in control of other things as well. And I'm probably offending somebody, but I don't know. I think that it's not necessarily a good thing. But I was saying, and my point is that you often see a lot of immature behavior in this. And the reason why I think this is the case is because when someone becomes part of a fandom, they're usually younger, and they are able to get more excited about things. I think that most people who are adults, if you're 25 and older, and and I'm going to exclude some people less than 25. Maybe if you're like 23 and older, I don't know. But 25 is when your brain fully develops and you're thinking completely like an adult and you're able to see things differently. Okay? So I'd say about 25 and older, I think that you shift your focus, and media doesn't, or maybe it's just me too, but media doesn't engage you as much. And I think that one of the reasons is probably because you've got a lot of other things in your life, and it's just hard to slip away from those other things. You've got worries. At least media doesn't engage me as much, but I think it's partially due to the fact that I just worry about stuff more. But you've got worries and you've got these different obligations, and it's just harder to get away. And besides the fact that you've developed, you're more complex than you were before. You're thinking at a more complex level. Therefore, these movies that weren't as complex aren't as engaging because you're like, well, I could see that, I could do that, whatever. And you're like, well, that wasn't that interesting. I've seen this in my life. And I think that the older you get, the more there's a certain age where your ability to think drops off. It's around 80 years old. But the older you get, I think the more complex you're probably looking. You want media that's more complex because you're developing. At least you should be developing. And you're not getting as much pleasure from that media that you saw before. Okay? So when you look back at your life, when you were 12 years old, if you saw a movie, most movies are better then, or you perceive them to be better then than they are now. So you may have seen a movie, you watched a movie and you're like, wow, this movie is really, really good. So you become a fan of that movie and you have a specific emotion connected to that movie. And this is where I'm kind of going on the side of the person in the fandom, a person who's obsessed. You have a certain connection to that movie, and it's a good connection. It's a good feeling inside of you when you watch that movie. When you watched that movie as a young kid, you didn't have as complex of a brain, so you were more engaged, and you went into this sense of flow. So when you're listening to really good music or music that you like, Daniel Fear, who I talked with, my second guest on the show, we talked about, I don't know if we talked about it on the show, where you listen to specific music and you kind of get lost in it. Well, that's getting lost in a specific type of art. And when you're a kid, you could get lost in that art more easily. And when you're an adult, I think there's a sense as an adult where you want to get back to feelings you had as a kid. Okay, so when you watch Star Wars, if you are, and I'm going back to Star Wars because I see it a lot right now. So you have more Star Wars movies coming out, and there's a lot of people who say, well, these newer movies wrecked my childhood because of what they did to the characters. But I'm just saying that because it's on my mind now, and it's a really big thing. And I think the most people are going to understand the Star Wars. They're going to understand when I talk about Star Wars as opposed to something else. You could pretty much fit any media source. If you want to pick your favorite band, or you want to pick your favorite artists, if you like artist, I'm actually talking about traditional art. If you want to pick your favorite movie, whatever, or TV series. I know a lot of people like Game of Thrones, but I think that if I talk about Star Wars, it's most people, younger people don't, kids will not, or if you're 12 years old right now, you're not going to be probably watching Game of Thrones. You might very well be watching it, but I think it's a little more mature, and you're going to understand Star Wars better. So I want to, and Star Wars is something that's passed through generations, so multiple generations understand it. So when you were watching Star Wars as a kid, you had a specific feeling, and now maybe you're trying to get back to that feeling, or Star Wars allows you to have that same feeling. And I don't know anyone who doesn't want to have that experience of flow in their lives, all right? But as I was stating before, media, you slip into media more. You slip into this sense of flow more easily with media because it doesn't take 10 years to learn how to watch a movie. Media is meant to make you go into this flow state. And I would say, well, I think that, and I stated this before, and I think that books and other things in the past were written differently so that it took longer to do this, but I think people could slip into this flow state more easily. And I think the reason why that is the case is because we have so much media now that we just have so much media to choose from. And so we can pick whatever we want, but at the same time, if we don't slip into that flow state right away, we won't like it. We'll switch over to something else. Okay? And so if you are someone who liked Star Wars as a kid, you like it now, and you are regressing. So regressing is like a psychology term, meaning you're acting the same way you did when you were younger. All right. So if you're 25 now and you saw Star Wars, oh man, that was okay. So Star Wars and those three, the prequels came out in the early 2000s. So you were a pretty young kid when you saw them. You had this specific emotion when you saw them, and now you're seeing new ones, and you see Han Solo. If you saw, I mean, this has been a few years since The Last Jedi, but you see Han Solo come out, and you have that same feeling. So then there is a certain conditioning in humans. There's both classical conditioning and operant conditioning in humans, at the same time as there being a person who actually interacts with the world. So you actually do have a will. You're actually interacting in the world, making decisions. You have you're deciding what's happening in your life. You're actually processing things in your brain. I think that's pretty apparent in your own experiences. Most people do think about things. Most people, I don't know of anyone. Even I worked with people who had mental disabilities, and even when you worked with those people, you still noticed that they thought about things. It wasn't just them reacting to something. So if you do ever run into someone with a mental disability, they're not just reacting to something. There's very few cases where someone is just reacting to something. But within your brain, when you see that new Star Wars film or whatever film you like, maybe you really like Harry Potter and you haven't seen it in a while, but I think that you were conditioned as a kid to react in a specific way, and now as an adult that same feeling is coming up. So the conditioning of that from your childhood is coming out, and you're reacting in the same way. So you may see some things that aren't fitting for, or ways that aren't fitting for an adult to act, but these adults are acting in that way because of the fact that they saw it as a kid, and that's the way they react to these things. And I talked about last week how I think that this is something that is becoming more mainstream. This is something that we're accepting more, and people aren't having as many hardships in their lives. So they may be growing up. And they haven't really grown up. Okay, they haven't really developed in the same way. Of course, this could all, instead of being tempered and matured, it could just be the case that people just naturally become obsessive with things. Okay, so I was saying that most academic subjects, the people in them are typically more mature. And I want to point out one subject where you might be thinking about this, one subject that parallels fandoms very well. And I haven't really interacted with many of these individuals. They're not in my group of friends. They're not in people I know. So I can't really assess how they react to things. But one area that is almost perfectly parallel, except for the fact that these people have been doing this for probably decades, and so they are experts in a way that other people aren't, is literature teachers or people doing literary analysis. And I say this because if you're a literature teacher, you are teaching media, right? You're teaching about a specific art form in the way that a YouTuber would talk about movies. And you may say that, oh, well, how I'm talking about it is more complex, but there are YouTubers who are talking about movies in a very complex way. So if you're looking at literature, you're analyzing literature, I would say that you're falling into the same thing. All right. But I don't want to rip on them because I don't know if they're obsessed with things. I know that you can be obsessed even in an area. So the question comes with this. So when I talk about art in my podcast, I always say art is something special, right? And you could probably say, well, you say art's something special, therefore, isn't it good to be obsessed, or not be obsessed, but really, really like art? Isn't it good that we connect to art in a way that is different? Isn't it good that we connect to art more quickly? And I would say, yeah, that's fine, but there's so much media. And if I say media, I'm generally connecting to something that is art. Okay, I'm generally talking about something that is art. Movies, I would say, have an artistic quality, are art in a lot of cases. Video games are art in a lot of cases. Books are art in a lot of cases. I don't know if I classify every single movie, every single video game, every single book as a piece of art, but I would say that in most cases they are, or in some aspect they are. So you might say, well, what's the issue? If we're meant to really enjoy art, if we're meant to slip into this flow state with art, what's the problem? And the issue is that I don't think all art is created equally. All right, I think that there is good art, and I think that there is bad art. Okay, there's a quote, and I don't remember who said it. And this guy, I think he's part of Bethesda. So if you know any video games, I think that he might be part of Bethesda, and but I'm not positive. And someone else, if you want to correct me on this, feel free. I don't feel bad about giving his name because it's pretty easy to find it. But he talks about how this idea of how video games are the only art form that requires someone to put forward effort to experience the next part of the art. Okay, there's a barrier between you and the rest of the art. You have to do something for it. But I think it's incorrect what he's saying. I don't think that video games are the only thing that does this. I think that all art in some ways should reflect this idea as well. So I think that all good art does this. So when I was talking to Dan about art in general and the creative process, after we were done, we talked for a while longer after the show, and he brought up, we were talking about different music we like, and we're actually, we've known each other for a long while, and we actually have fairly similar music tastes, and we both started listening to more folk music. And there's a singer that he introduced me to after the show, and he's like, oh, have you ever heard of Townes Van Zandt? And I was looking at his stuff, and I saw some stuff about him, and someone said, oh, why do you write such sad music? And he's like, I don't write sad music, I write hopeless music, or I'll write hopeless songs. And if you ever were there, you'd realize the difference. You'd understand the difference between hopeless music and sad music. And I think that this gets to the point of what I'm trying to say. So art is made for us to better understand the world, or how I define it. I think that art is made for us to better understand the world, and part of that world is understanding ourselves. All right. We can of course view people, as I was stating in the last episode, as people, or the last episode about obsession, as people who are just chemical reactions and they are just chasing pleasure. But I think we're more than that, a lot more than that. When you interact with art, you may run into art that you've never experienced, something that allows you to understand that art in your life, right? You may actually have to think about that art a lot. You may actually have to experience life to get to the heart of what that art is. I think that this happens a lot with books. I think there's specific books that kids don't enjoy as much as adults. And when you read a book and you hate it as a kid, and then you read it later on as an adult and you really like it because you understand things differently. Now, I think this is most prevalent. I think this is really easily seen with humor. So I really like the show The Fiddler on the Roof. I think it's really funny. I was in The Fiddler on the Roof in high school, actually. And in The Fiddler on the Roof, there's a lot of parts where everyone's going to laugh. But there was one day where I was in the show, and it was pretty much all the parents were watching the show. And there was a part where there was an interaction between one of the characters and his not his girlfriend, because it's set in the early 1900s, 1800s. I'm not the early 1900s, I believe, but it's set his fiance. So an interaction between him and his fiance, and he's going to ask her to marry him, but he cannot get the words out, and the kids don't get the joke. The kids just can't, they don't laugh at all. They don't think it's funny, but the parents think it's hilarious. And the reason why the parents think it's hilarious is because they have grown and they've matured and they've gotten older, and they understand where that piece of art is coming from. Okay. And I think that with art, you don't experience the fullness in some cases because you actually haven't experienced art life in a specific area. Like, I'm not going to understand a piece of art that's directed that talks about grandchildren in the same way that my parents are, because they are grandparents and I don't have grandchildren. But for those of you who haven't experienced something, I think that if I haven't experienced something, I can still look at the thing and start to think about it and try to get a sense of what that feels like. One thing Daniel Fear and I talked about when he was on afterwards, or toward the end, he said this as well. He's trying to write music in a way that allows someone to experience what he's feeling. And I think that all art in some way is trying to do that. So in writing, it's a little different. So I may have a thought in my head, and I'm trying to convey that thought as best as I'm able, so someone's able to think that as closely as I thought that thought, right? Or in the same way, I'm trying to paint a picture of a town, and I want that image in my head to be as clearly represented in someone else's as it is in mine, or in the same way as Dan was talking about. I want to convey an emotion. And when you run into aspects of your life or pieces of art that you haven't experienced those things yet, you can still look at how it's displaying things. So I haven't had someone close in my life die, but I can still read other people's accounts, and I can try to experience that same feeling through my creativity and imagination to try to get to the heart of what they're feeling and what that experience is like, okay? And some people, I have a friend, and I think he's stated this several times, it's like you can't feel what someone else is feeling. There's always this divide between you and someone else, okay? And I think that to a certain degree that's true, but at the same time I think there is this ability of people to connect to other people in ways that seem impossible. Just through language we're able to talk to someone and we're able to convey our feelings, and maybe they haven't even necessarily had those feelings, but in a lot of cases people can actually experience that same feeling or something similar, something like that feeling, and they can connect to that person because of it. So that's where I'm going to leave you with Obsession. That's what I'm thinking. I think that's a good ending point, because it has some closure because it's bringing it back to the idea of art. And I guess I bring it back to the idea of art a lot. So I hope that's a good thing for you to think about. I hope this talk about obsession, what my thoughts are, what art should really do in the modern age. It shouldn't just give you whatever you want. It should actually take some effort on your part, or it should actually take some life experience. And maybe our art isn't as good because our lives aren't as difficult, and the people writing and making the art, they just don't have the life experiences to convey life in a way that is as human as it should be. All right, we're going to go to our logical fallacy. Now it's a really big downer. Our art sucks. No, I'm not saying that. There's a lot of really good art out there. Our logical fallacy of the week. So we've been talking about red herrings, and red herrings are things that distract you from the argument towards something else. So our argument this week is argumentum ad populum, and that is the bandwagon fallacy, or the appeal to the majority. And this is a really big one, but if you don't know what this one is, so essentially when you're making an argument and you say, well, everybody thinks this way, therefore this must be correct, that is a bandwagon fallacy. It's argumentum ad populum, appeal to the majority, okay? This is the typical kid who's saying, well, my friends are doing this and everyone else is doing this, and the parent rightly says, that's incorrect. Just because your friends are doing it, just because your friends think something, doesn't mean it's correct. As I always say about logical fallacies, you need to base your thinking off of actual logic, go through the process of thinking, try to get rid of those fallacies. There are certain places I don't think logic can, I think logic is what we have to use to think with, but I think there's areas logic can't cover, if it makes sense. So I think that logic can only go so far, and that's the end of our thinking, right? But logic encapsulates mathematics, in my opinion. It encapsulates science, because without this logical framework, we don't get to with science, we don't get to this idea of, okay, I need to figure out an idea, then I need to test the idea to see if it actually conforms with reality. So that's where I'm going to leave you this week. I hope that you do have a really good week. This is the first week of April, so finally it's spring, I guess, and I guess experience good art. Try to find some good art. Try to find some art that is really well done. The artist is just someone who is really skilled in their work, but at the same time, it challenges you. It doesn't necessarily hand everything to you. If whether it's a book, whether it's a video game, whether it's a movie. All right, have a good rest of your week. My name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.